It is not part of Transparency International, but it's a separate think tank on fiscal policy and fiscal transparency. I forgot the name, it's in my paper. Adopting a fiscal rule, I think it's particularly important in countries which rely on natural resource revenue. It's important for all countries, but particularly for those, to get first a measure and second a policy frame which is based on cyclically adjusted balance of the government. In the case of RREs, it implies adjusting for both domestic GDP cycles and commodity price cycles, like it is done in Norway and in Chile, and in very few other commodity exporters. Colombia adopted it 6 months ago or 8 months ago, and possibly some other which I'm not aware of, but very few countries up to now. The rule should be consistent with acyclical, or much better, with counter-cyclical spending and spending smoothing, preferably based on assumptions and forecasts of key variables provided by independent committees or by independent fiscal council, not by the budget office of the government, and possibly anchored in a fiscal responsibility law, although that also depends on each country. Sovereign wealth funds are key complements of cyclically adjusted balance rules, and even more so for countries that want to save for future generations. They are an absolutely essential instrument. They require effective and transparent corporate governance. They required also transparent information of the transfers between the budget and the fund. Investment portfolio composition should be set by maturity preference, by risk aversion of the government. That is how we do it in Chile, that's how it's done in Norway too. Investment management should be bound by transparent guidelines and close public monitoring. It's essential to have very, very good information put out into the public. And here you have another measure by the Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute, which is an international think tank which looks at sovereign wealth funds and organizes annual conferences on sovereign wealth funds. And here they grade on a scale from 1 point, the lowest level of transparency, to 10 points, the highest level of transparency, sovereign wealth funds of many different countries. You will see a lot of oil exporters there. The largest sovereign wealth funds are those of oil exporters in Kuwait and Qatar, but this is not the size of the funds. It's simply the grading of the transparency and putting out into the public the way they invest and the investment decisions they actually take. And here the highest ranked are one of the US Alaska Fund, the UAE, Singapore, Norway, New Zealand, Ireland, Chile, Azerbaijan, Australia, and then you go down the line. Fourth and final, adopting committees and or a fiscal council. What are the independent committees? Are those that focus on a narrow task like key budget forecasts or fiscal reforms, or the projection of output gaps and growth and commodity prices. A different thing, and much more important in my view, is an independent fiscal council, which should be based on an ad hoc law, board members probably voted by Congress, like an independent government agency, responsible for many tasks, among them the following. Number one, responsible for revising the budget assumptions, projections, monitoring, and also the provision of recommendation of corrective actions regarding fiscal sustainability, let's say. They should provide medium and long-term fiscal projections, assessment of fiscal sustainability and corrective actions, assessment of macro-financial effects of fiscal policy. For instance, financing of new government programs should be assessed by them. Intergenerational accounting, a la Auerbach and Kotlikov, they should do. Assessment and recommendations on government asset and liability management, and technical advice and public hearings to Congress on budget management and fiscal reforms. Again, there are probably in the world these days around 15 fiscal councils. To my knowledge, all of them in OECD countries, not one yet in developing countries, and they are certainly a key cornerstone for a sound and frontier type of fiscal institutionality. So let me conclude. I think the world has done much progress in some areas of macro-financial institutions and policies. For instance, regarding monetary policy, most countries in the world have independent central banks, and also the conduct of at least conventional monetary policy. Unconventional, we know less, is according to a widely established, pretty agreed upon framework of how to conduct monetary policy. But in the fiscal realm, both institutions and policies face major challenges. We lag, I think, 20 or 25 years behind monetary policy. In these challenges are to strengthen sustainability, to strengthen counter-cyclicality of policy, and to strengthen transparency and accountability, both in industrial and emerging economies alike, as we have learned and are learning the hard way in Europe these days. Among resource-rich economies, they particularly face serious challenges to break out of the vicious circle between fiscal policy weakness and commodity cycles. I think these are the boom days, but our countries, or the countries that export or are highly dependent, we face an increasing risk of what we will do once or if the commodity price boom comes to an end or reverts. So can it be done? Yes, for sure. I think it can be done. It requires a lot of institutional and legal and political consensus making and passing some laws, but I think certainly there are by now many examples, some examples in the world which could be could offer the guidelines of how this can be done. That's all. Thank you. Who runs the show here? Joe? This was one question by Marcio.
Klaus, thanks for the excellent presentation. I have a couple of questions regarding the implementability of all those desirable rules that you referred to. The first one was something that Roberto Rigobon mentioned yesterday, was the pressure on the early 2000s for Chile to deviate from the rule, since the savings were deemed too high by many of the political players. So how to resist to those pressures, which ultimately showed up both because of the earthquake and the crisis to be the right thing to do. And the second thing is how to deal with the Lucas critique applied to those rules. For example, here in Brazil we have a target for primary surplus that we've been complying for the last I don't know how many years. But however, there have been many gimmicks. For example, the Treasury gives subsidized loans to BNDES, and BNDES gives these subsidized loans to the firms. So overall there is a loss. But then BNDES, since it's a financial institution, posts a profit and then transfer dividends back to the budget, and then this is a primary revenue. So things like that have been, in 2010, for example, it was over 1% of GDP because of Petrobras rights issue. So how to deal with these things?
Institutions, as Acemoglu and Robinson tell us these days with their wonderful new book, Why Nations Fail. I think it's that. For instance, it was very hard for Mr. Velasco during the boom years, before the crisis hit after Lehman Brothers, to stick to the rule at the tune of 7-8% budget surpluses, unheard of in the entire history of Chile. Every state company brought forward a fantastic investment project. They wanted to draw on those resources, and Velasco successfully resisted those pressures. And the president behind him, certainly, Ms. Bachelet, was a key element of this. Now, I think the way to strengthen that, in the case of Chile, is fiscal councils. A fiscal council is really needed to put even more an additional line of defense against those pressures. And the other is very transparent accountability and budget management, so that all these gimmicks are really forced by law or regulations or fiscal responsibility laws to be put on the internet the month after they hit the budget. So people can actually have access to that. The specialists would denounce these type of practices. They would deviate from standard international fiscal accounting standards put forward by the IMF and other institutions. So I think it's institutions. You have to work at your institution. You have to create political consensus among economists, and then influence policymakers, bring forward proposals to strengthen your fiscal institutions.
Well, I think everybody agrees with that, but institutions are endogenous.
Absolutely.
So even in this literature you mentioned, like Acemoglu and others, they needed some initial instrument for institutions and then to justify the results. So I mean, so it's not clear how to create institutions.
Short of a revolution, it's very hard. But I also think we don't have to go back to the colonial history to justify that we are not able of putting those institutions into place. Sometimes a strong leadership by a new president or coalition or government or professional economists. In my countries, professional economists have and will have in the future a major role in promoting welfare improving institutional changes in many different realms, from health to fiscal policy, from monetary policy to regulation of labor markets. So I think you have a role to play. Robert had a question.
I'm not sure I understood correctly what these fiscal committees do. It sounded like they're making forecasts, but it sounds like they're also setting budgets. And so does this mean that the Parliament or Congress or whatever abdicates its ability to set tax rates and expenditure and gives it to this independent committee to decide?
I very much appreciate your question, because clearly I did not explain that, Robert, and thanks for giving me a chance to explain it now. No, neither these small committees that provide forecasts for output and for commodity prices, nor the Fiscal Council in England and France and Germany sets fiscal policy. Fiscal policy meaning the total level of government spending is defined by the incoming administration. So at the beginning of each new administration, the administration has to define for its next 4 years what will be exactly the fiscal rule, including the number of B star, which is the cyclically adjusted balance of the government. That's determined by the incoming administration, and then given its pre-commitment, year by year, it will define an overall level of government spending which is equal to this P star balance plus trend tax revenue. Now, it can deviate from that and from the underlying price and output projections by telling Congress, look, we're sitting in an emergency, like in January 2009, and we got to deviate from this rule, and therefore government goes to Congress, and they propose in January 2009 an entirely more expansionary level of government spending than what was approved in the budget law 4 months before in September 2008. So there is room for deviations, but the deviations normally are under very exceptional times. In normal times, during booms in particular, and during moderate busts or growth reductions instead of deep recessions, the rule would apply. And there is no delegation of fiscal actions, and no delegation, even less so, about the decision about the composition of spending from the government and Congress toward these committees of the Fiscal Council. The Fiscal Council, which I advocate very strongly in Chile and other countries, is basically a watchdog which does assess the fiscal and macro implications of the budget law, of proposed tax changes, of proposed changes in government spending programs, and also watchdog of the execution, so that precisely these type of gimmicks which Marcio was mentioning can simply not occur. That's the role of this watchdog, similar to the CBO.
So, it's the publication of failures to stay within the budget, except for exceptional circumstances. That
and
is
almost
its
in
role.
real time. They should do this the week after or the month after these things occur. Exactly right.
So I think it's fair to say, based on many of the papers that have been presented here at the conference, that it's very difficult to predict changes in levels of commodity prices, but we can actually predict volatility. And so that leads me to ask the question whether it has been debated in this literature if it would be sensible for, from a sort of risk management point of view, that these committees should actually try to use forecasts of volatility. So, for example, in 2008 and 2009, the volatility would have been very high, and then this saving for a rainy day, which seems to be one of the ultimate objectives, should kick in. So, in other words, the committee should very much look at forecasting volatility as much as forecasting future levels of commodity prices.
That's a very good policy implication which I bring home from this conference. I share it completely. That's right. That's right, Alan.
I'd like to put this in the context of a project that has been going now for about 12 years, originally called You Decide, whereby the taxpayer actually used the concept of the decision of governments, how they allocate taxes, and the way, when you do your tax return, for example, at the end of the year, you would be given an option. Would you like to spend 15 or 25% on education, 15 or 25%, or 15, 20, 25% on infrastructure, and so on, all the way through? And the reason that this was looked at seriously by governments, and including through the United Nations, was very simple. And that is that when you actually do activity-based costing of how much it costs to pay tax, how much tax you're really paying, how that tax is used and what benefits it gives in public goods and services, it was discovered that in many cases, and particularly among multinationals, that they were working between 3 and 9 months of the year just to pay tax and social charges. Now, systemically, that's not feasible to take on the responsibility of looking after the environment and social responsibility and all the rest of it and pay tax at that level when government is no longer providing those goods and services efficiently. So you have a movement where the business sector has perfect reason to question, together with government and together with society at large, in a more participative process. And it's actually beginning to work more at the local level, but it does have a macro to micro link. How do you see that fitting in with these fiscal committees and councils? And do you see a future? I mean, some people will say, oh, well, they'll never do it, they'll never allow this decision and so on. But it's a factor of society. It's a societal reality. Would you like to comment on that? Thank you.
I don't relate this proposal of yours in this 12-year project to the work of the fiscal committees or councils, because they have no say about the composition of government spending. They are asked like the CBO in the US or in Canada, or the new the new fiscal councils in continental Europe and Britain, they're asked to assess, run macro models basically, about the macro impact or the growth impact of expanding, let's say, infrastructure spending from 2.32% in Brazil the last 10 days, as we heard from Pedro over lunch, to twice that. But they are not asked to provide, other than a technical assessment, a recommendation about the composition of spending. So these are other institutions or other tools or other mechanisms through which citizens, both natural persons, people, like they do in Switzerland very actively at the local and even at the national level, at the federal level, and corporations to express their preferences for different categories of public expenditure.
Is there not a case in that sense for this sort of computation? You know, how much does it cost you to pay tax? By the time you've paid just the nominal tax, the costs of the accountants, the auditors, the lawyers, the buildings, the electricity, the paper, etc., and how much it costs the government to collect that tax.
Absolutely.
When they make their decisions to take that sort of criteria into consideration, and how would you suggest that they sort of, you know, they get their act together in each country, you know, the fiscal council and these sort of organizations?
It depends on each country, but this is the type of issues which, for instance, the Productivity Commission of Australia looks upon, which is the effectiveness and the efficiency of government at large, or government tax collection, or the burden imposed on the private sector. So the Productivity Commission in one country and Growth Commission in the other, I forgot which one, of New Zealand and Australia, they do engage in those type of studies responding to that type of question. Given that it's so related to growth or productivity or sectoral issues, probably it's more for such a commission or independent agency than for the Fiscal Council. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
So this concludes this conference. I thank you all for coming, the speakers and the public in general. So thank you very much. And next year, probably we're going to have another one. Hope you can come. See you.